Since her beginning, the Church has been a church of fasting and abstinence, and Lent is a time of the year when we take a special look at these practices. But are they universal or personal? And if they're not personal, then how do we make them mean something for us? Today I will sit with a panel of Salt and Light producers, and we will look at fasting, abstinence, and eating fish on Fridays. But we begin with canon law.
Abstinence from eating meat or some other food, according to the prescripts of the Conference of Bishops, is to be observed on every Friday of the year, unless a Friday occurs on a day listed as a solemnity. Abstinence and fasting, however, are to be observed on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. The Conference of Bishops can determine more precisely the observance of fast and abstinence, as well as substitute other forms of penance, especially works of charity and exercises of piety, in whole or in part, for abstinence and fast.
Canon law is very clear that each Episcopal conference has the final word on the practice that is to be observed in that particular country. In Canada, the obligation is that we should fast and abstain from eating meat on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and that every Friday in Lent is a day of fasting. On top of that, Fridays during the whole year are days of abstinence from meat, but Catholics may substitute special acts of charity or piety on this day. Now, joining me now to explore what all this means is a panel of Salt and Light producers, Kris Dmytrenko, Cheridan Eygelaar, and Carlos Ferreira. Welcome. Maybe before we start, let's try to maybe define fasting and abstinence. What would you say, let's start with you, Kris, what would you say is the difference between fasting and abstinence?
Well, abstinence would be, basically not eating a particular kind of food. Like if you were abstaining from meat, you would not have any of that food during the day.
Okay.
Whereas fasting is traditionally understood to be one full meal plus two smaller meals that aren't even the size of a full meal. So you're looking at less than 2 meals. So that's more about quantity of food, whereas abstinence, I guess you could say it's about the type of food that you would.
Because I've heard people say that well, abstinence is a type of fasting. So we're talking the Church is very specific in what she means when we're talking about fasting.
Sure, I mean, they're certainly related, but I guess it's two sides of the coin, I suppose.
Okay, so maybe quickly go down the list. Do you fast during Lent?
Yes, certainly on Fridays and especially on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, we all have an obligation. So that's something that is.
And I'll get back to the obligation,
optional.
but yeah, do you share it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I reduce even just in my general for that 40-day period. I reduce all the stuff that I love to do, right?
Okay.
And so I try to keep it more steer. I love dairy, so I make sure to reduce that as much as possible.
Yeah, okay. So you already have like 3 more questions. Do you fast during Lent?
Yes, I fast. I also do an abstinence and plus the fast.
Okay.
Because my purpose is on Fridays I give up on sugar.
Okay.
It's abstinence.
Okay, so this is what I want to get back to, and Cheridan brought it up. So you give the things that you love. Does fasting need to be giving up something? Usually people give up something that's, sugar, it's not good for me, I shouldn't be having so much sugar. Is that really fasting? That sounds like diet. It sounds like a health thing.
Well, it's the intention behind it, right? If you're doing it to lose weight, then obviously the intention is wrong, and it's more of a cult of the body than it is about sort of penance and creating that contrite heart.
The fact that you like what you're giving up, does that make the fasting more meaningful?
As opposed to you're saying, something that maybe we're just used to having a lot of, but we don't necessarily love.
Yeah, like I eat pasta every day or whatever,
yeah.
so I should just not eat pasta.
Certainly that would be probably more difficult for you than maybe giving up sweets.
Yeah. Or watching TV, which people do as well, right?
Yeah. But the objective is the fact of you giving up on something, it's good for you. think the objective is that.
So if you just giving up on something is good for you.
Exactly.
Whether it's doesn't matter what it is.
Because if for example, if you love, on my case, I give up on sugar because I really like of sugar.
Okay.
And the point I think that is the main point. If you give up on something you really love and you miss.
Okay, because I think that sometimes we talk about Lent being a time of penance. Penance/sacrifice. So is there a connection then between fasting and sacrifice?
Well, I mean, instead of giving up something you love, it could be a question of convenience. For example, I'm trying not to eat out during my lunch break. It's not necessarily something that's tastier than what I would be bringing myself. But it is a question of convenience, so that is my particular sacrifice. But I want to get back to something that you said, Cher, about how if it's for health reasons, it's not really valid. And I don't know, I don't begrudge people who are doing it for health reasons. There's a lot of people, not even Catholics, who will give up chocolate, for example. But I think that we, particularly as Catholics, have such a holistic way of understanding food. I mean, we understand it in a sacramental sense that the Eucharist nourishes us bodily and spiritually. We also kind of intuitively see that when we get together, as family members eating together, that there's something spiritual about it. And I think in the same way, it works the other way around. I think that if we're eliminating what is harmful to our bodies, then I think that we can say that it does have some kind of spiritual benefit, even if our motivations might not be pure, even if our motivations might be something that's vain. And that certainly, if it's being done for vanity, then that's
you know what, and I sort of agree, because the end is what's important. Sometimes, I don't know if we're getting into like an ethical here about the means. It's like we make New Year's resolutions, and then it seems that that's what Catholics do during Lent, that we have all these New Year's resolutions that we failed at New Year's, so that I'm giving up smoking or giving up coffee or giving up, not that giving up sugar is, I think not commendable.
I think it's not that thing of giving up, and you are giving up just for the, just because I need to give up because it's my church.
Yeah.
Tell me. I think we are preparing for the most important feast on the Catholic calendar.
Yes.
And it's like you are receiving someone important in your house, and you need to clean your house to receive that people.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a very, very unique way to look at fasting and abstinence in terms of cleaning.
Yeah, you need to clean yourself. You need to prepare yourself to that big moment.
And just to sort of counter something that Chris had said, I'm not sure if I understood you properly, but I really think that it's more important for us to do it with the right intentions. And I think that, for example, if you are doing it just because it's a health reason, I think that can be a preoccupation with self, right? Because really Lent is a time for us to look beyond ourselves and to look to others, right? Okay. So you're creating a spirit, a place of being prepared for the Lord, and it's an inner mystery, right? So we're entering into this inner mystery of what these laws, these guidelines are trying to point us towards, right?
Well, but I mean, not respecting your body and being a glutton, that is something that we can understand that there is a spiritual component to it. So you're right. I don't think it necessarily always means that if you're giving up something, that there's a spiritual benefit. But I guess I'm just saying that there very often is a connection, and so I think we should be careful about judging people and their own intentions.
But let me ask you this, because I agree with you that the intention is what matters. Doing it because it's an obligation, or because the church says so, because my mother told me so, does that not defeat the whole purpose then?
Because it's not a mature decision then, right? Lent is a time for mature decisions, as Pope Benedict says. And I think that, I think it was actually Archbishop Prendergast, he gave us a really great example. He said there's two boys walking down the street, and one of the boys turns into the candy store and he says, "Why are you going in? There's, it's Lent. You should be fasting from candies." He said, "No, I can have candies, but I've committed myself to going to Mass every single day."
Right.
And so that is the more mature decision, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't give up candies, but that you should always be aiming to get closer to the Lord, right? If it's not leading to deepening of your friendship with Him and spending time with Him, then what's the point of all of this?
I think for some people there might be even the temptation to it becomes sort of like an ascetic Olympics, you know.
Yes,
You want to sort of challenge yourself like you were running a marathon, not necessarily for any spiritual gain, but just to sort of maybe prove something to yourself.
Or to other people.
Or to other people, yeah, if you're a little too vocal about what you're giving up.
Well, other thing, when Cheridan said about the question of if you are doing because your parents said, or I think that could take you some time, because you will do the question to yourself.
Yeah.
Why I'm giving up? Why my parents said to me to give up? Well, on the first years you are doing by yourself just because your parents ask it. Well, you are not on the purpose, but you can get it.
Yeah,
you can one day arrive and it's this.
No, I remember having this conversation with my mother too. I'd say, well, what's the point in giving up meat when I don't even eat that much meat anyway? So it's not really a sacrifice. And she said, well, if it's not a big deal, then why do you object to doing it? So she kind of flipped the argument on me. So she had a good point. Yeah, mothers, there you go. We need to take a little break, but this conversation will continue. It's not a long break, so don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll continue the conversation, and in particular, we'll look at how fasting and abstinence can actually help us in our spiritual journey. So stay tuned.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail. Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, or call us toll-free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
Yes, as far as I know, it is a requirement for any Catholic during Lent to completely abstain from meat on Fridays, and so I do.
Recently, I haven't, and the reason for that is because I figure that sometimes eating meat for me personally, or even in my culture, that it's not so much of a sacrifice anymore.
Sure, I'll do it. Because first I am a Christian, and like a Christian person I have to do it in memory of how much Christ was suffering for us.
Well, it depends. Certain years I give up meat during Fridays on Lent, but other years I don't. And the reason why I don't on certain years is because I don't think it's the meat itself that has the value, but it's the act of giving something up in one's life that sort of helps make room for God and for acts of charity towards a person's neighbor.
The reality is I actually don't eat meat at all during the week, so to reciprocate, I actually intentionally try to eat meat on Fridays.
Well, part of it it's the law of the church, and the law of the church has spiritual reasons, and it's been a way for me to be more part of this Lenten season. You know, looking forward to what Lent is all about, the death and resurrection of our Lord.
Because sometimes cultures don't have meat, or all they eat is meat, so it would be too much or too little of a sacrifice. And what I think is important is that it does become a sacrifice that's relevant.
What I do before Lent is I sort of take stock of my life and think about what I might give up in order to make space for these things. And sometimes that can be that can consist of giving up meat during Lent, and other times it'll be something else.
Those were some thoughts by some of the people behind the scenes here at Salt and Light on eating meat or fish. Now, this whole idea, and we were talking about eating meat, the church says, and in some conferences and universally, that's the obligation, that we should abstain from meat. I always feel that seems a little random. That maybe there was a time and place where that made sense, but if I lived in you grew up in Portugal, most people eat fish there anyway, so shouldn't you be giving up fish? If I grew up in China and we eat rice but no meat, shouldn't I be giving up rice? And I guess that's why each Episcopal conference might have, but it seems that universally there's still this idea that we should give up meat. Does that mean eating I mean, you're a vegetarian.
What do you
do? The first time on Salt and Light this has been revealed to the world.
Kris Dmytrenko is a vegetarian.
Yes. For me, obviously, it isn't very useful, the idea of abstaining from meat. But personally, I'm in favor of its application, just as they've done in England and Wales and restored it universally there. And certainly in our culture, I think that it is particularly relevant because even though even though we have the opportunity to substitute something else for it, very easily there can be the temptation to substitute nothing at all. And from what I was reading, it's not sinful if on a particular occasion you don't give up something on Friday, that you don't do your penance. But in general, generally refusing to do penance, not only is it not very Catholic, but it is sinful for us not to engage in penance on a regular basis.
And that's Fridays throughout the year, not just
Fridays
Lent.
throughout the year.
Yeah, that's
and so I think that
important to
having
note.
sort of some basic framework is very useful for people, so that they have something that they can give up. In fact, I think it would be very helpful for me, so that I remember for the Episcopal Conference to say, well, if you're not giving up meat, maybe you should give up cheese or something else.
Right, so that you don't have to think about it.
Yes,
because there's a benefit
because you
there.
can forget.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you grew up in a country, again, we're revealing everything about our Salt Light producers.
Yes.
Sheridan grew up in Namibia, and
Well,
meat is very common.
Oh, very important there. It's part of the culture. So yeah, giving up meat there would have been difficult. But
Even
in
for
Cape Town,
so even poor people, they could afford meat. It was a regular.
well, they would have had a different type of meat. I mean, a lot of the
Okay.
tribesmen there,
Right.
they only eat meat. They don't have any vegetables, just
Right.
because it's a desert
Yeah,
area.
yeah.
But in, for example, Cape Town, where my mom's family's from, having fish on Friday, well, I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, it's easy to do. So it's not exactly like a sacrifice,
Yeah.
right? To not eat anything on that day would be a sacrifice.
Right.
And given that it's fairly, most people eat there, that would be more difficult,
Yeah.
right?
I think that the idea of, abstaining from meat, in my case, would make sense, but substituting it doesn't make sense. So if I normally have meat with rice and vegetables, replacing the meat with a piece of fish doesn't make sense. Eating only rice and vegetables makes sense, and that's abstaining. But I think a lot of people think that they can just go out to Red Lobster on Friday nights, and that defeats the purpose. No.
Well, I have an interesting story with the question of abstinence of meat, because when I went to my spiritual director asking, well, I feel like I don't live well the period of Lent, and he asked me, well, what you do on Fridays on Lent, and I told him, well, I do what everyone does. I give up on meat, and his question was, well, you really don't like fish? And I said, no, I love fish. I'm Portuguese. Well, we have fish everywhere. And he said, well, where is the abstinence?
Yeah.
Where is the fasting?
Yeah, absolutely.
And he kind of said, well, you need to figure out something. It's will be a big sacrifice for you to give up on. I have to say, I'm having more difficulties here in Canada than in Portugal to give up on sugar.
Yes.
Because the sugar here is everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think that is the objective, that you need to feel, because you are, like I said, you are preparing for something big.
Right.
And you need to feel your abstinence, your penance on these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think the guidelines that the bishops give us and canon law, these are all extremely important, but I look at them as training wheels in terms of, you're learning how to cycle, and these are ways to remind you, these are the guidelines, this is how you balance, this is how you go forward towards Christ, right? No. But I think that if you stay just doing what they say just because they say it, you're not growing.
When you were growing up, did you think that the obligation was to eat fish on Fridays rather than to abstain from meat? I think I grew up believing that. Everybody thinks that it's fish on Fridays. Yeah. Even I think that has been adopted by the secular culture. You go to a university dining hall or whatever, and they host fish and chips on Fridays. Yeah. And where does that come from? It's so ingrained in this sort of psyche, but it's meaningless.
I have to say that I actually looked forward to Good Friday, and because my mom makes this pickled fish, and so I really enjoyed it. And my mom said that was not the point, Cheridan.
Yeah, they want a Good Friday. It's like they want to go and get calamari at Mr. Greek's or something. It's like, well, does it really? Okay. How does, just to kind of maybe help us bring this to a close, if we agree that it's not about eating fish, it's not necessarily about abstaining from meat, but having that obligation helps us at least to have a starting point. How does the idea of fasting, abstinence, and maybe penance, if I can relate that to it as well, help us grow spiritually?
I think that it comes back to suffering. And I agree totally with
yeah.
and I agree totally with Cheridan that if it's something that is too comfortable, then it's not necessarily bringing us closer to the point of it, which is to unite our sacrifices with those of Jesus on the cross, and also to be able to somehow be able to also further appreciate his sacrifice by experiencing discomfort, because I think particularly in our Western culture, we're not used to any kind of deprivation at all. I mean, we can pretty much have, you know, whatever we want whenever we want it. And so, and also I think that it relates to other works of piety or other works of charity. It's bringing us out of our comfort zone and doing something that is uncomfortable for us, whether it's more prayer, whether it's, you know, going to a soup kitchen.
Yeah, that's the thing I was going to say, that we don't just do that in
isolation.
An isolation from, because we were talking even earlier about, you know, it makes sense to, if I'm going to abstain from meat, not buy meat at all, do it for 40 days, how much money am I saving? And doesn't it make sense to actually use that money to give it to the poor, almsgiving?
In my country, on the Portuguese conference, have the tradition of all the money the parishioners save with the fasting and abstinence during Lent, giving it to a cause. Each year a different cause. And all the national church, for example, I remember 2 years ago we offered our money to build a school in East Timor, and we saw footage from them building the church with the money we save on during Lent.
Interesting. Yeah. So all the money that you're saving with on sugar.
Exactly.
We need to conclude, but we always like to conclude by leaving the last word to the one who is the Word. So if we can reflect on our conversation by listening to a passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." That's from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 12 to 15. Carlos.
Well, I think it's a sign of Christ needed to prepare for his own ministry. And that ministry is what Catholic Church is about. We are all here because Christ saved us and he raised. And is that we are preparing during these 40 days. I think that is the main reason of fasting, of abstinence, of penance during these 40 days, is that we are preparing to receive Christ raised from the dead.
Well, thank you, Cheridan.
It's a time of focusing in, and I think it's also a time of spiritual exercise, right? We're preparing ourselves to proclaim. So that means we have to get the spirit strong. We have to remove the distractions, the physical limitations, or the perception of physical limitations, so that we can be focused on the Lord instead. And so I think that it's a time for mature decisions. It's a time for growing up, a time for scrutinizing your life and the reasons why you do things, and looking forward to how can I be closer to the Lord.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, what strikes me about that passage is that Jesus chose to go into the desert and to experience this. And you know, yes, we have a lot of suffering in our lives, a lot of discomfort already, but what is particularly unique about Lent is it's a kind of suffering and discomfort that we choose. And so we are choosing to do this. We're not, you know, the church is asking it of us, but it ultimately has to be our own personal choice, and I think that's where we see the spiritual fruit come from.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I can take anything from this, is exactly that it is an obligation, and there's an aspect of us being obedient to the church and the church teaching, but we are also called to have, you know, to have free will to choose, and that gives it a little more meaning. So I hope that this has been helpful for you as much as it has been for me. Our panel today has been Kris Dmytrenko, Cheridan Eygelaar, and Carlos Ferreira. If you missed any portion of this episode, or to watch any Perspectives Weekly episode, visit us on our website, saltandlighttv.org/perspectives. You can watch all our programs there, and also remember you can visit us on Facebook. That's where we post our question of the week. We cannot do the show without your perspectives. That's all for tonight. Have a blessed Holy Week, and we'll see you next week.